A good day to one and all. Today I shall discuss with you the salient features of Indian philosophy, which is a very important topic that is included in the course Early Indian Philosophy of the BA Philosophy program of the University of Kerala. So let us take a look at how philosophy is defined in the Indian tradition. In the Indian tradition, philosophy has been called as Darshana, which means a direct intuitive perception of reality. It also signifies a perspective or a point of view. In the latter sense, philosophy is called as a Siddhanta, which is basically a standpoint that is arrived at after sincere deliberations and brainstorming. Indian philosophy has always been rooted in epistemology, and that is the reason why the Greek philosophers who were in constant touch with the Indian philosophers always used to refer to the Indian philosopher as a pramanika, that is, a thinker who bases his conclusions on the pramanas or the valid sources of knowledge. Let us first take a look at what were the different epochs in the development of Indian philosophy. Systematic philosophizing in India commenced with the Vedas. Upanishads, which constitute the last portions of the Vedas, contain the acme of Vedic philosophy. The period of the Itihasas, the Puranas, and the Dharma Shastras that followed the Vedic period is also replete with philosophical ideas and concepts. The Bhagavad Gita, one of the greatest treatises of Indian philosophy, was composed also in this period. The third and the most important phase of the development of Indian philosophy is the period of the Orthodox and the heterodox schools. The classification of Indian philosophy into Orthodox and heterodox schools is based on the acceptance or rejection of the Vedic authority by the different schools. The schools that accepted the authority and infallibility of the Vedas were designated as the Astika Darshanas or the orthodox schools of Indian philosophy, and those schools which rejected the Vedic authority and also the infallibility of the Vedas, they were termed as the Nastika Darshanas or the heterodox schools of Indian philosophy. The Astika or orthodox schools were 6 in number and therefore were called as the Shad Darshanas. The root Shad refers to the number 6. 2 of these schools directly followed from the different sections of the Vedas. They were Purva Mimamsa, that followed from the Karma Kanda of the Vedas, and Uttara Mimamsa, that followed from the Jnana Kanda of the Vedas. The remaining 4 schools were independent schools of philosophy, but they claimed that their philosophical insight was derived from the Vedas. They unanimously accepted the authority and the infallibility of the Vedas. Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, and Yoga were these schools. The Nastika or heterodox schools challenged the authority of the Vedas. Charvaka, Buddhism, and Jainism were the 3 Nastika Darshanas. Charvaka is a school of staunch materialism, while Buddhism and Jainism, apart from being great schools of Indian philosophy, were also major world religions. Now let us embark upon the discussion on the salient features of Indian philosophy. Every school of philosophy has its salient or important features, and there are certain distinguishing marks for every tradition of philosophy. Indian philosophy, to begin with, is essentially spiritual and meditative. If you look at each and every school of Indian thought, it is but obvious that most of the schools of Indian philosophy are deeply spiritual and religious. So the undercurrent of spirituality and meditation is deeply entrenched in the whole of Indian philosophy. It is primarily a quest for truth, that is, the absolute reality from which the world of experience arises, is sustained, and to which it finally returns. That is basically the concern of Indian philosophy. In all the schools of Indian philosophy, one can see this unending quest for truth. Indian philosophy attempts to know the nature of the self by redirecting all human faculties and energies inward. The ensuing realization of the true nature of the self is not merely an intellectual understanding but an integral experience. One can find verses like Avrta Chakshuhu in the Upanishads, which testify to the fact that Indian philosophy attempts to look into the self by turning all its energies inward. Indian philosophy does not stand aloof from the challenges posed by mundane life, but boldly faces these challenges and offers solutions to them that have life transforming implications. In India, philosophy and religion have always been complementary to each other. Philosophy has provided the necessary rational ground for religion, and religion has in turn offered the platform for the experiential realization of philosophical ideals. All systems of Indian philosophy acknowledge the presence of sorrow and misery in life, but this initial pessimism is overshadowed by a final optimism that suggests permanent solutions for the transcendence of sorrow. Many Western critics of Indian philosophy have pointed to the element of pessimism in Indian philosophy, but actually, if one completely understands all the tenets of Indian philosophy, it is obvious to the student of philosophy that all initial pessimism finally ends up in a great optimism. Transmigration of the soul from one body to another is accepted by all systems of Indian philosophy except the school of materialism, that is Charvaka. Liberation from repeated cycles of birth and death is accepted as the ultimate end of human life by all the schools of Indian philosophy except Charvaka. This end of human life is designated through different terms such as Amritatva, Moksha, Kaivalya, Mukti, Apavarga, Nishreyas, Nirvana, etc. The primary aim of all systems of Indian philosophy was to arrive at complete, coherent, and consistent systems of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, even if it required the merging of its philosophy with that of another school whose tenets were complementary to the said school. This is obvious from the way a merging of Indian philosophical schools took place after the 10th century AD. The school of Vaisheshika that was focused on metaphysics was found to be complementary to the school of Nyaya that focused on logic and epistemology. So, after the 10th century AD, one can see the merger of the schools of Nyaya and Vaisheshika to form one solid, very, very important, complete school of Nyaya Vaisheshika. Similar was the case with the schools of Sankhya and Yoga. Sankhya had a very rich dimension of metaphysics, while Yoga laid down an entire path of practice that ultimately resulted in the highest state of liberation. So the tenets of Sankhya and Yoga were found to be complementary to each other, and as a result of it, the two schools decided to come together. And as a result of it, we have the school of Sankhya Yoga, which has got both a very rich system of metaphysics as well as a very coherent and systematic philosophy of logic and epistemology. Moving on, the ethics in the context of Indian philosophy did not concern itself merely with evolving norms of individual and social conduct based on rational reflections and experiences. Now, we are aware that the Western philosophical tradition from time immemorial have largely focused on the development of individual and social modes of conduct, and their philosophies and schools of ethics have largely been founded on these ideas. But if you look at the Indian tradition, we can see that Indian philosophical schools were primarily concerned with the ultimate goal of human life, and therefore they developed ways of life that were conducive to the realization of these goals. So, in this way, the ethics in the Indian philosophical context stands shoulders above and different from its counterpart in the Western tradition. Indian philosophy essentially developed a faith in the concept of Ritha, the cosmic order that governs the entire universe, the concept of Dharma, which is of pivotal importance in the entire philosophical tradition of India, is an attempt to accommodate and redefine Ritha in the human context. Indian philosophy has been enriched and strengthened by a long standing tradition of textual exegesis that has involved several generations of texts like the sutras, the bhashyas, the vartikas, and the tikas that varied in scope, content, style, and purport. Indian philosophy has developed a rigorous and thorough system of philosophical disputation that has enabled each school of Indian philosophy to prune its philosophical standpoints and achieve logical consistency and intellectual prowess. Right from the Vedic period, Indian philosophy has remained impersonal. Thoughts and ideas have remained in the foreground, and individuals who have propounded them have only found a passing mention, and that has resulted in the obscuration of the historical details of many philosophers. This is a very important point of criticism that is often raised by Western scholars against Indian philosophy, that many of the historical details in the development of Indian philosophy are obscure. But one should understand the spirit in which Indian philosophy basically developed. The Indian philosophers were more interested in bringing out with clarity the tenets of their philosophy rather than making huge claims about who the person was who was responsible for that particular thought process. So, this concept, this element of impersonality in Indian philosophy has been referred to as the ideal of apaurushayatva. Moving on, the law of karma is universally accepted by all schools of Indian philosophy. In the current world, the theory of karma has received universal acceptance throughout the world. Most of the schools of Western tradition have also understood the significance of the law of karma and have accepted it within their folds. Indian philosophy has always remained flexible and has adapted to changing socio-cultural narratives. The birth of modern Indian thought during the Indian Renaissance is a classical example of the ability of Indian philosophy to adapt and rise up to the changing circumstances and challenges. If one takes a look at the period of the Indian Renaissance, it is obvious to any student that India was socially, culturally, politically at its lowest point. There were superstitions and evil practices throughout the society. So, the primary concern of the Indian philosopher during the period of the Indian Renaissance was to reform the society and cleanse it of all these evils. So, therefore, we can see that modern Indian thought, which basically grew from the period of Indian Renaissance, primarily focused on the ideal of social reform. But these elements of social reforms cannot be seen in classical Indian philosophy. So, from this, it is obvious that Indian philosophy had basically adapted to the changing socio-cultural and political conditions and actually churned out a new philosophical vision that incorporated the burning need of the time, that was to incorporate social reforms into philosophy. With this, we come to the end of the discussion of the salient features of Indian philosophy. Thank you.